I often imagine what would people like Jim and Aneurin Bevan and Cledwyn Hughes and Alasdair Morgan and all those people, if there'd been an assembly earlier, what sort of assembly it would have been? Do it now. It would have been on fire, that. It would have been on fire.
Hello, my name is Theo Davis-Lewis. I'm a third year student at Oxford University and the lead campaigner for the hashtag Cofio Jim campaign. In this film, alongside Llanelli Online, the Cofio Jim campaign will show you two former MPs talking about their memories of Jim and what they thought about his life and career. First of all, you'll hear from Gwenoro Jones, who was Carmarthen's MP from 1970 to 74.
And he got hold of me. Bachgen bach, he said. Bachgen bach. I remember difficult years. Classics, eh?
Then you'll hear from Denzil Davies, a long-time servant to Llanelli and West Wales. He was the MP here from 1970 to 2005. He was also in the Treasury during the 1970s and the Shadow Cabinet during the late 1980s.
I don't know about me, I can't talk about me, but Jim remembered for somebody who stood up for Welsh industry, for mining, but also stood up for Welsh culture and all that was best in Welsh culture. He came from that background.
My name is Dr. John Evans. I worked in the coal industry for 20 years as a coal miner. Jim Griffiths was my Member of Parliament. But that type of passion Jim most certainly had. I remember him speaking in Ammanford just before he retired as a Member of Parliament. I don't think I've seen a politician speaking with such emphasis, passion, belief in all my life.
Nia, thank you very much for speaking to us today about Jim Griffiths. This book here, James Griffiths and His Times, talks about politics in his lifetime, what he went through. What do you think he would make of politics today and the issues that we're talking about?
Well, I think he might find the means very different, that we are on social media and all the rest of it, and life has changed and pace is different. But I think many of the issues remain the same. Tackling poverty for him was a big priority, making sure that mothers can feed their children, making sure they had family allowance, making sure that people who've got injured industrially get properly compensated. I think a lot of the issues were still there, and I think that he would be fighting as passionately today as he was in those times.
And Jim obviously as well was very effective in getting those things changed, the Family Allowance, the National Insurance Act, the Industrial Injuries Act, all of these things he brought in and helped pass through Parliament. Do you think then politicians today, or a politician today, are as effective in sort of sorting out these local issues but also these national issues as well, in terms of whether it's through Parliament or campaigning locally? Can they do it?
I think there was tremendous vision in the Labour government of 1945, and I do think some of the reforms that they brought in were very much to be appreciated and applauded, because they were thinking ahead, and they were thinking that even at a time obviously of financial constraint you can still be bold, and that's what we really want to see in today's politics.
How do you think it is seen today?
Well, I think that we certainly in the Labour Party stick very much by the principles that he stood by, and we certainly do want to see radical change. We certainly do want to see young people have much more security in their work. We do want to see an end to 0 hours contracts, but you have to be in government to do that. And that's the difference, and that is really what should be our priority now, to make sure we do get another Labour government.
And Denzil Davies actually mentioned to us, there's obviously at the time maybe the same sort of link to you now. The Labour Party wasn't really sure of itself, its identity in the 60s and 70s. Maybe it's not so sure at the minute either. But Denzil Davies said that when he was elected as an MP in 1970, that Jim told him that it was all about jobs. That's what he should be looking to do and looking to change. What did you think then, coming in to be an MP in Llanelli? You've got things, there's problems and issues surrounding Trostren, sustainability, homelessness, drugs in Llanelli. Were there any principles that you took from your predecessors and you've tried to use and sort of sort out any matters that you have in Llanelli now?
Well, I think jobs still is a major priority. Everybody wants to have the dignity of having work and having a job that pays properly and that they can live on and they can share with their family. But the point is now, of course, our priority has to be protecting jobs through the Brexit negotiations. We must get a Brexit deal which protects jobs. That's what really matters now to people here in Llanelli. And once you've got the jobs, you've got the income for families, families can choose how to spend it, and you've also got the money for taxation to provide the services that you want. So yes, the priorities don't change, but the challenges change.
So obviously Jim actually went through a lot before he was an MP. I think he was an MP when he was about 46. So he was a miner at 13, was the president of South Wales Miners Federation, campaigning as a trade unionist. He had this sort of belief in these principles before he was an MP and went in to sort of make a difference. MPs now, or AMs now that go into politics, and such as yourself, what drives people like you into politics? Is it that experience that have come before you, or was it current issues or historical matters?
I think it's absolutely vital that in all our levels of government, be it local council, be it Parliament, be it the Welsh Assembly, that we have people who have experience of life, all sorts of walks of life, and have lived in different places, have had the experience of living in different communities, and bring that experience to Parliament. So I very much do think we want to be as diverse and as representative a group as we possibly can. And certainly it is that wish to get things changed. It's when you've seen injustice that you really want to put things right. That really does drive you, and I think that's as strong a force as ever.
Well, of course, Jim was a major figure in Welsh politics, and indeed British politics, right? So even when I was young, before I was in politics myself, in the 50s and the 60s, on the hearth at home, Jim Griffiths was a big figure in Carmarthenshire life and in Welsh Labour life. He and Irene Bevan, of course. And the mining community, where I lived in, the Gwenfaith Valley and the Amman Valley, Jim had been their champion. He had been the miners' agent, South Wales Federation, before he became an MP in 36. And of course he had achieved many, many things in government which people tend to forget about. The National Insurance Act, that is even operative today, was brought in by Jim Griffiths. Family allowance. The first family allowance paid in Britain was in 1948 when Jim was a cabinet minister. He brought in the family allowance. 3 million people benefited from it in 1947-48. And then the Industrial Injuries Act. People owe a lot to Jim Griffiths. Those things that have stood the test of time, since the end of the 40s. And then he was moved by Wilson, by Attlee, to being Commonwealth Secretary, or Colonial Secretary it was called in those days. Vast experience, vast background, and his contribution to the ordinary working man and woman of this country has been immense, for which he has never had enough credit.
But a more local issue then is perhaps what Jim's contribution was to Llangadale and what actually happened with that incident. And people don't know, I've not read about that a lot, but people don't know about it. What was Jim's contribution there?
But parliamentary-wise, because to do things like that, it would have had to have had an Act of Parliament. It was all stopped by the activities of Jim and Lady Meg and Lloyd George. Just as much as Trostre would not have been where Trostre is if it hadn't been for Jim, and I suspect Cynhydre as well, when that was sunk in the 60s, that the arm and influence of Jim Griffiths was somewhere there in the background. As I said, a lot owed to him, and he has never had the full credit that he deserves, and it is high time that Llanelli recognises his most famous son.
What do you think was the main achievement then in the 60s and 70s to do with Jim and the Labour Party in this country?
People in Llanelli in the 60s and the 70s didn't appreciate what Jim had done. Maybe because he lived in London and he might not have been down as often as he could to Llanelli. He had been in government, he'd been a cabinet minister, and it wasn't easy to travel around in the 50s and the 60s as it is today. No telephones, no television. So the contact between an MP and a constituency was not all that easy back in those days. I don't know whether that is part of it, but his contribution was immense. And in relation to devolution, as I said, the office of Secretary of State is here because of Jim Griffiths. No question about it. And in the mid-50s, there was a campaign for a Parliament for Wales. And Jim was part of that, along with S.O. Davies, Tudor Watkins and Lady Meg and Lloyd George. And to be fair, Gwynfor as well. And I remember that those were violently against all that. Devolution would not have happened in the 60s if Jim had not done the spade work in the 50s, for which he was vilified often inside the Labour Party. That is what Labour and Wales owe to Jim. There's the devolution commitment. And also the elected council for Wales, by the way. He argued for it when he was Secretary of State. And he only lasted until 1966. So Jim's antecedents, Jim's credibility, Jim's importance in relation to devolution has never had the attention that he fully deserves.
So you've mentioned devolution there, and obviously we've had, 20 years of devolution now. How do you think Jim would have assessed the progress of devolution in Wales and across the UK? And as well as, what do you think?
But I'd have thought that my guess is he's glad it's happened. He would be glad it happened. He'd be glad that more and more powers has come its way. Maybe more powers than what he envisaged in the 60s. He'd be happy with all that, I'm sure. Probably he would want to go further, because remember he was part of the campaign for a Welsh Parliament in the mid-50s. So that's where his heart was. He was thinking of something bigger than an assembly. He was talking of a Welsh Parliament, as was S.O. Davies, as I've said earlier. So whilst he would have been happy with how things have gone, I suspect there would be a point with him that we haven't gone far enough. And I have no doubt whatsoever he would be terribly frustrated as to the way the Assembly operates. It is so benign, isn't it? Very calm. Everything very orderly. There's no outbreak of major debates, are there? You don't get disagreements on a traditional Welsh campaigning, debating style. And people complain that people are interested in Welsh politics. And the Assembly people say that they don't pay enough attention. Don't they know why? It's boring. That's the reason. It's boring. No, he would not have been happy with that. And he would have wanted to go further. And if you think of current politics, he would be distraught about what's going on about Europe. Jim was very strongly pro-Europe in the mid-50s. And that's again where he and Bevan clashed. He and Bevan clashed a lot. They had a different dimension of Wales, of Europe, and certainly of the Labour Party. They were on different wings of it. But Jim was very strongly pro-Europe. And I suspect he would be one marvelling as to what on earth is going on and how damaging it would be to the Welsh economy. And Jim knew what damage was, mind. In the 20s, miners' strike. In the 30s, the Depression. Jim Griffiths had gone through it all, along with all sorts of other people. There was no need for Jim to read about it. He lived it. He went through it. And if I can tell you a story, when I became a candidate in 1967, August, I believe, 67, pretty soon afterwards, we held a dinner in Jim's honour in the Smith Arms in Llangosteth. Because I was born near a more famous pub, the Dynevor Arms. Back in those days, the Dynevor is a house now, I think. And Jim was the guest speaker. And here I was, 24 years of age, green behind the ears, knew a fair bit about politics, but hadn't even hardly made a political speech, other than a few went to become candidate. And I remember there he came in his mid-70s then, I suppose, Jim. Towering, impressive, like a granite rock of a man, the way he looked facially. Strong man. You could tell Jim had been a strong man in his early life. And there I was trying to impress him, and the Labour Party, Harold Wilson's government had been devalued, oh dear me, what is the word now? I forgot. I talk so much about devolution, the reduction in the pound, devaluation of the pound with Callaghan, and in those days the economy in Wales was far from clever, the mining industry in serious trouble, mines closing, on and on and on. So I turned to Jim and said, in Welsh, these are difficult days, Jim. And he got hold of me. Bachgen bach, he said. Bachgen bach. I remember difficult years. Classics, eh?
My name is Denzil Davies. I used to be the Member of Parliament for Llanelli. I took over from Jim Griffiths in 1970 and I retired in 2005. In fact, I was a member for 36 years, I think, and Jim was 35, or was it 35 and Jim was 34. Anyway, I beat him by 1 year. I don't think I beat him with much else, really.
Tell us a bit more about you to begin with, you know, your upbringing, how did you get into politics, what's your sort of story?
Well, my upbringing, I was born in a little village outside Carmarthen called Llanelli. My father was a blacksmith for some time, and then he had a very bad accident just towards the end of the war and lost his eyesight. And there is a link there, in fact, to Jim Griffiths.
His father was a blacksmith, isn't it?
His father was a colliery blacksmith, I think. But the link isn't that. As a child, I remember going down to Carmarthen with my father to collect a pamphlet which had been written by Jim Griffiths as Minister of National Insurance, because I think his first cabinet post was Minister of National Insurance. And of course my father, having had an accident, an industrial accident, was obviously concerned to find out what changes Jim had instigated in Social Security. Previously there was the Workmen's Compensation Act, which wasn't very good. So Jim brought in the national insurance, for injuries, and we went to Carmarthen to collect the pamphlet written by Jim Griffiths, who was in fact a cabinet minister. So I never met him, obviously. I was a child and he wasn't there. But that was my first recollection, if you like, or memory of this remarkable man, whose greatest achievement, in my opinion, was to establish the National Insurance Act. I think many people at that time who'd suffered so much in industrial injuries would thank him greatly for what he did. And then, of course, he became Secretary of State for Wales. That was considerable time afterwards, and that also was a great achievement. Another great achievement was one of the leaders of the South Wales miners, especially the anthracite section. And I met him after I was chosen as his successor in 1968, and he retired in 1970 as Member of Parliament for Llanelli.
And talk us through that then, because that's sort of the early development of, you know, your first instance of knowing about Jim. But then when you took over as an MP, what was it like, you know, to take over the seat, a historically Labour seat, a safe seat, from somebody, obviously, as you say, who'd represented the workers so much?
Well, it was quite a challenge because he was so well known. He'd been a cabinet minister. His connection with the mining industry, of course, was considerable. And so somebody like me, who was a bit of a lawyer and nothing else, had difficulty, I think, in filling his boots. But my memory of him before he died was that he was living in London, in Putney, and a message came through to me as a Member of Parliament for Llanelli, and the message was in Welsh from a local councillor, Mae Jim yn marw. Now, the word marw in Welsh sends shivers down your spine. And I was at that time the parliamentary secretary for John Morris, who was Secretary of State for Wales. And John and I went down to Putney in the ministerial car to see a former Secretary of State whose health wasn't very good. And we talked in Welsh, we talked in English. And I remember the final last words he said to me was, Denzil bach, he said, carcwch am yr atholeth. Look after the constituency. And that's the last time I saw him.
It's very powerful because you said before, you have to look after your constituency, that's your first duty.
Yeah.
Do you think now then, just a comparison to what happens today, do we get those sorts of politicians now who think like that and behave like that?
No, I don't think we do, but that's no criticism necessarily of people who are in post at the moment. But the world has changed, and now there is far more bureaucracy, I think, far more staff, if you like. Members of Parliament perhaps devolve more of their power to their staff than they used to. So it is quite a completely different world. But I think my main memory of Jim is that he was a very nice man. He was gwr mwyn. He was a gentleman, despite all the battles in the 30s, which he had with, especially with South Wales anthracite owners. All the battles, it did not in fact go to his soul. He still remained a gentle, fine man. And I remember him telling me, he said, the only people I really disliked, he said, which is surprising coming from him actually, the only people I really disliked were the owners of South Wales anthracite. But there was one man who was associated with the owners whom I liked, he said. I said, who was he, Jim? He said his name was Howe. And he was a solicitor from Neath, who was the solicitor for the South Wales anthracite, who was, of course, the father of Sir Geoffrey Howe.
Yeah. Wow. Yeah, because you talk about those achievements that Jim had. Maybe there was a peer that actually wrote in after Jim had had his obituary in the Times and said, no, it wasn't actually the establishment of the Wales Office, which was his greatest achievements. It was him as the Minister of National Insurance and what he did. But if you look locally then, and he was an MP for 34 years, I think it was, what do you think Jim's legacy would be if you look at what he did during that period for Llanelli and for the wider area there?
Well, his legacy partly was, of course, the battle to keep industry in Llanelli. The battle for Trostre and Velindre, for instance, to keep the timber industry going. He had been a miner, he had been a miner's representative, and he felt for the economy. He felt for the production of wealth through manufacturing industry. The world has changed. But obviously he kept very close to the trade unions and very close to industry, really.
And do you think then it was the fact that you had politicians like Aneurin Bevan at the same time is why we don't actually hear much about what Jim did to bring Trostre here or keep Trostre here? Is that why? Is there anything else?
Well, if you mention Bevan, I don't think there was much love lost between Bevan and Jim. Partly to do with Welsh culture. Jim became Secretary of State for Wales. Jim was Welsh through and through. His brother Amanwy had won a number of chairs. If you went to the family's house in Ammanford, as I used to go from time to time, the place was littered with this Eisteddfod chairs, which Amanwy mainly had won. So Jim was much deeper into Welsh culture, mainly because of where he was born and brought up. And Aneurin Bevan, of course, who looked upon the world really as a kind of universal world with no boundaries, if you like, a world of socialism, whereas Jim's world was a world of Welsh culture as well as the Labour Party.
And a big difference between them as well, which is often discussed, and we've spoken to Gwynoro Jones about it as well, is the fact that both men have different views of devolution and the Council of Ministers for Wales, elected representatives for Wales. Because of what's happened now with devolution, it's actually happened in the first instance. What do you think Jim's assessment of that would be? I know you can't speak for him?
Well, he would be very pleased. I mean, he'd always campaigned for it. And when he became Secretary of State for Wales, and his health wasn't good at that time. I'm sure he looked forward to a more devolved body than just the Welsh office, which was mainly civil servants taking decisions. So he would have been very proud of the fact that he was the first Secretary of State. The Welsh Development Agency did a lot of good work. And it was a quango, it was a bureaucracy, it was under the control of the Welsh office, really.
Yeah.
And it brought a lot of investment into Llanelli. And so when we lost that, I think there was a gap, a transition period, between losing that and the Assembly acquiring the kind of economic powers which the WDA had, in fact. I think now it's got better, and I think that the Assembly now has acquired the mantle of the WDA, but it took a long time.
So you think then the Assembly does its job well? Do you think that, are you excited by the Assembly and what those elected representatives are doing?
Well, I think it's difficult to be excited by it, but on the other hand, as I said, it has brought Wales to the forefront. It's now got a Prime Minister, if you like. It's got important politicians, and I think that fits into the modern world, really.
And then finally, for now, what would you like Jim to be remembered for, and also what would you like to be remembered for?
Well, I don't know about me. I can't talk about me, but Jim remembered for somebody who stood up for Welsh industry, for mining, but also stood up for Welsh culture and all that was best in Welsh culture. He came from that background.
My name is Dr. John Evans. I worked in the coal industry for 20 years as a coal miner. Jim Griffiths was one of the most prolific members of Parliament in Wales here during the 1940s, 50s and 60s and until his death in 1975. During that time he was working himself up the ladder in terms of his trade union involvement. He became Secretary of the Chamber of Trade in Ammanford here. He became a Miners' Federation representative. He became Deputy President of the Miners' Federation, and in I think it was in the early 1932 or 1933 he became President of the South Wales Miners' Federation, which was one of the most powerful positions in Wales as far as trade unionism was concerned, and of course trade union leadership in the coal industry. Everybody had respect for Jim. They used to call him locally in Allenford Jimmy. You know, he had so much affection by the electorate that he was called Jimmy. Jim joined the industry when a miner was being killed every 6 hours on average, and a miner was seriously being injured every 4 hours. At the time in the Amman Valley here, from the historical records that I've managed to elicit, you know, you had a situation where there was either an illness or a serious injury that had taken place in most of the households in the Amman Valley area here because of the preponderance of people that were working in the coal industry. Jim, the MP, Jim, the trade unionist, was seen as an advocate to try and ameliorate the problems that people had in their daily lives, and he did a very good job of it. I think that one of the great achievements of Jim Griffiths was that he was part of a team that brought in the nationalisation of the coal, steel and rail industry. Politicians in this country have become alienated from their electorate, especially, as far as the European members of Parliament are concerned. I don't think most people know who their European Member of Parliament is. Even though you've got members of Parliament that hold surgeries for their constituents, they don't interact with them. It's a business relationship. When Jim Griffiths was a Member of Parliament for Ammanford, as an example, he used to hold public meetings. People could give their particular view of what was happening nationally and internationally, and Jim used to answer questions. There are no public, if you notice, with these modern day politicians, there are hardly any public meetings with them. And to a lesser extent with the assembly members, it's as if they're frightened of meeting the electorate these days, different to when the time Jim Griffiths was a Member of Parliament. He met his constituents, he had dialogue with his constituents. These modern day politicians, they failed badly as far as that is concerned. Members of Parliament are just administrators for the state as far as I'm concerned. When Jim Griffiths was a Member of Parliament, and Denzil Davies as well, they had a passion for what they believed in. They believed in something. There's been this, Jim Griffiths as an example, he was a type of fellow in a public meeting, he'd be on his feet and he'd bang the table because he believed in what he was saying. I think that style of speaking comes from the chapels, and of course Jim was a member of Christian Temple Chapel in Ammanford. But that type of passion Jim most certainly had. I remember him speaking in Ammanford just before he retired as a Member of Parliament. I don't think I've seen a politician speaking with such emphasis, passion, belief in all my life. In my opinion, the National Assembly for Wales has just turned into what was described when they were campaigning for it as a glorified county council. I really do think that what has been done here in the Miners' Club in Ammanford has been significant in that it's preserved the heritage of mining in the Amman Valley. My grandchildren, I'm glad to say neither of them will work in the coal industry, but they still, even now at this early age, they ask questions. What did you do in the colliery, Grandad? And this is a very important thing. We must preserve our history, we must preserve our heritage, and I think that some kind of funding specifically designated for the coal industry in the Amman Valley here should be made available as soon as possible.
He was a complete person, really, in terms of both his politics and his wider culture, and I think that's what you will remember for.
Might have the Sussman, might have the Scarlets, might have Carwyn James, might have Barry John, you name it. People that I greatly admire and knew well in the case of Barry. But Jim's place in Llanelli has been ignored for too long.